All right, all right. We're gonna test to make sure that everyone can hear me. And then we're gonna dive into these MCAT MCAT quick sheets by Kaplan's high yield test review. But first, I want to make sure that I can hear myself. So I'm gonna pull up my channel, make sure it works. What you doing, cat? What you doing, cat? My cat's going crazy. All right. Now that I'm situated, let's get started. So, let's see here. There's 24 pages. Okay. Seems like we're starting with behavioral sciences first. All right. Let's see here. Do I have like a highlighting tool that I could use? Can I? Oh, yeah. Make it full screen? Annotation? I don't know. Two-page view? I don't like that. I guess we'll just do it in presentation mode. And we'll make a note of the stuff that I need to review more. So I'm at the point I did a lot of UWorld, about 95% of the question bank. I'm doing pretty good on that. Got like a 75% overall in the question bank, right? But I'm trying to narrow down on like my weaker spots to try and improve my score by a few points. So, let's see if I can make this a little bit bigger here. Zoom in a little bit. There we go. I'll just do it like this. Or maybe, dang it. I'll just do it like this. Why not? So let's start. All right. Biology and behavior. We're going to start with the organization of the nervous system. There's three types of neurons that we should know that make up the nervous system. A motor, a interneuron, and sensory neuron. So for this, I know this pretty well from my comparative anatomy course, where motor is efferent, which is technically the bottom if you think of a caterpillar, which will go up into the ventral horn of the spinal cord, which will interlock to an interneuron, will synapse into a sensory, which is on the top horn of the spinal horn. So generally the motor neurons control like motor function. Interneurons are just like synapsing between, generally for reflexes. Sensory is for like sensory input of like once we probably have to talk about sensory perception later, like right here, which is just responding to a senses in our environment. All right. The parasympathetic branch of the autonomic system is focused on rest and digest. Our sympathetic nervous system is focused on fight or flight. I remember this from health psychology, is where the first time I heard of this, surprisingly enough. But I always remembered parasympathetic as pooping system, controlled for like our resting and digesting for pooping. And synthetic, I remember being stress. So I'm going to unpresent here and zoom in to make these images bigger. All right. So we look at the parasympathetic system. When we activate our parasympathetic system, usually after eating or after resting for a while, our pupils constrict because we don't need them to be expanded to let a lot of light in to be able to see our whole environment because we're not being chased or anything. We'll stimulate saliva to break down different lipases or pepsinogens, different types of enzymes that break it down while we start eating. We will constrict our bronchi because we don't need them relax because we're not exerting ourselves, so we don't really need the larger surface area when they're relaxed. We don't need our heartbeat to be fast if we're just relaxing. It stimulates peristalsis and secretion, functions of digestion that we'll probably talk about later, which makes sense why it correlates with the rest and digest system. Stimulates bile acid, same component, but for lipids. Kidneys, bladder, same thing. We want to activate these because we won't activate them in the synthetic system. Because the synthetic system is for fighting or flighting. That's why we want to have our pupils dilated so we can have more light to come in to help us see our environment better, to see if we can have any other external dangers in our environment. We can have an accelerated heartbeat because we need our blood to be pumping quick if we're going to run out of there. And we'll likely have piloerection or sweating in response of us running. And we have inhibition of peristalsis and secretion because we want to save our resources. Like, why do we want to digest if we want to use those resources for running away from a enemy? Same with our liver. We'll want to make glucose so that we can use it when we use all our glycogen storages in our muscles. Secretion and adrenaline, and we don't want to pee ourselves when we're running away from an enemy. We don't have time for that. And of course, this is an interesting one. It stimulates a orgasm apparently from the thrill of everything going on. Okay. Let's look at the. Why does it move so slow? Okay. It's a little delayed or something, but we'll keep working through. Then we got the organization of the brain. There's three major different like divisions of the brain, and it's not like how it would look if you divided the brain up in like the front, back, or anything. It's more of like things laying on top of things. So technically, our ancestors most likely had was the hindbrain, which consisted of the cerebellum, medulla oblongata, and the reticular formation. We say our ancestors had these because we learned how to walk. we had to have a good motor control of our respiratory system, and we had to have a good processing center for visual information. And then it got more complex, which we developed a midbrain, which contains the inferior and superior cocci, which many different things intertwine with, especially for like emotions. Certain emotions are associated with inferior and superior cocci. One's also visual processing. Then we have the forebrain, which we most likely recognize. It's like the bigger the bigger cortex on the top of the brain. And then the thalamus system, the hypothalamus that we know from our endocrine knowledge. It's the basic organization of the brain. Now let's dive deeper into the forebrain. So the forebrain has many different parts that are very essential for our daily living, such as the thalamus, which I learned about in abnormal psychology, where they said it was always like a train station where all the information would be directed to the thalamus and then integrated there and transmitted to the correct cortex that it needed to go to. And then hypo means below, so below the thalamus is the hypothalamus, which we know considers the four F's and is one of the main sites that secretes like endocrine hormones that are tropical that will travel to distant sites. All right. And then the basal ganglia, it controls like smooth movements and helps maintain posture stability. And then the limbic system we know is for emotion and memory and like a pleasure seeking. And then we know amygdala is associated with fear and aggression. Hippocampus is for memory. And fornix is communication with the limbic system. All right. Oh man. Let's just present. It's so buggy. There we go. Okay. Now let's look at the cerebral cortexes, which is divided into four specific lobes. So the main lobe that we usually associate with decision making is the frontal lobe, and it basically is controlled our executive function and our impulses. So when you drink alcohol, you know that your frontal lobe is being inhibited or suppressed because you're having less of like control of your impulses. On top of that, it has the Broca area, which is known for speech production. It has the main primary motor function. And then I think of the parietal as like the parent, so it's like on top. It is associated with like somatosensation of different feelings of touch, pressure, temperature, and pain throughout the body. As we see here is like the homunculus model of how our brain is mapped on our cortex of our brain. Of course, occipital is like medical word for eye, so it's just the visual processing pathway. Temporal, I think about where your temple's located, so it's like associated with sound processing, speech production. Motion is interesting to me because I don't know. I didn't know that until now. All right. That's basically the four lobes. Pretty good so far. Let's look at the influences on behavior. So, as I learned in systemic physiology, acetylcholine is the major neurotransmitter involved with muscle contraction, generally under our own somatic control. But it doesn't always have to be somatic, though. It's generally also involved with, and also generally involved with sorry everyone, I just got a text. Sorry everyone. Let's get back to it. Where we were. We'd already discussed acetylcholine of being like controlling muscle movement and everything with that. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are like the major neurotransmitters for what we were talking about earlier with our hypothalamus, fight or fight responses. Dopamine I associate with addiction, but it's majorly controls like our movements and our general stability. I also know this is like the major neurotransmitter affected in Parkinson's. So that's how you can remember smooth movement. Serotonin is generally known for happiness moods, sleeping, eating, dreaming. GABA is known as like the stabilizing unit. And endorphins are like the natural painkillers from like example is you run a marathon and that's like what basically kicks in after running for so long. There is a general thing about nature versus nurture, debating on how genetics influences our behaviors and how the environment affects our individual traits. That's why we use different like studies of like family studies, twin studies, adoption studies, just to analyze like our behaviors if they will change based on genetical factors or environmental factors. Okay, that's basic biology and behavior. Oh, I'm tired. Let's try sensation and perception. The major difference between sensation and perception is that sensation is the converting of physical stimuli into neurological signals, while perception is being used as like a sensory input of making sense of our environment. Okay. So, for sensation to occur, we will have to have certain types of receptors to respond to a stimuli, which are known as sensory receptors, which usually convert popular guy today. All right. Stand by. We are back. So about the receptors, essentially neurons detect a stimuli in our environment, which transmits the physical stimuli into a electrochemical one, which will flow down the neurons, which will be later projected to a specific region in the brain. That's the general basis of sensation. So this is not not one of my favorite topics to discuss, which I'm glad I'm reviewing it right now. 'Cause I generally forget things about this theory here. So let's discuss. I know the threshold. It's basically the minimal threat. It's basically the minimal stimulus that we need for us to detect a signal. So, like a certain threshold for us to notice something in our environment. And then basically, Weber's law is just saying that we will have a certain proportion ratio where we will detect a range of changing stimuli to a object, for example, like holding a weight. You may not notice the difference between holding a 2 pound weight and then holding a 2.2 pound weight. But if you switch it to a 5 pound weight, you'll notice a difference between the 2 pound weight and the 5 pound weight. So that's basically what the Weber law is explaining. It's detecting like the proportion ratio of where we will identify that there is a change that we can detect. Signal detection theory is not my favorite theory. That's why I'm going to go through it slowly, and I'll probably be reading it word by word to try to get like a general understanding. Signal detection theory says the effects of non-sensory factors such as experiences, motives, and expectations on perception of a stimuli. So I think about I don't know if people still do it anymore, but like the hearing test that we had to do in school, where you had to put headphones on. We had to put headphones on, and this lady would say, raise your hand every time you hear a sound. And there's gotta have been times where if there was a sound present and you raise your hand yes, that would be considered a hit. But if you don't raise your hand and there was a sound present, that would be considered a miss. Or if you raise your hand saying that there was a sound, but there was actually no sound, that would be considered a false alarm or a false hit. Or If you say that there is no sound and there was no sound present, then that would be a correct rejection technically. So that would be considered correct. That's my general idea behind the signal detection theory. They do like to test this response bias, so I'm gonna review this because I don't really have a definition that I put in my head rather than just like a common sense definition. So let's see what the actual definition is. Response bias examines using signal detection experiments with four possible outcomes: hit, misses, false alarms, and correct negatives. Okay, sure. And then a adaptation is a decrease in response to a stimulus over time. I feel like that one should be included in the classical conditioning and outward conditioning category of this one. But that's just me. All right. Let's look at our vision pathway here. So for vision, the eye is a organ specialized. The eye is an organ specialized to detect light in the form of photons. And this is just a diagram of the eye, which we have the cornea for the very protective layer out here. And then we'll have the lens, but there's a vitreous fluid that like keeps the shape of the cornea. And there's capillary or ciliary bodies that connect to the lens that can change the shape of it. And then there's vitreous humor. The fovea in the eye is where cones are only present. And the optic disc is basically the blind spot in our eye that lacks basic cones or retina, where basically the optic nerve leaves the eye. So, for when light goes through the eye, it goes through the cornea, then the lens, and then it will shine right onto the retina here. Where this picks up, the retina will become depolarized, which will cause a stimulus to go to the optic nerve, which the optic nerve will leave out of the eye in the optic chiasm where it'll cross over certain data into the two different occipital cortexes in the back of the head. But before it gets there, it goes through optic tracts, or basically bodies of neurons, which will go to the lateral genial nucleus, and then the thalamus, which will become presented to visual radiations and visual cortex in her brain. Oops, what did I do? Okay, let's look at hearing. Hearing and vestibular sense. I am pretty confident in this one. Oh, shoot. So, basic role of hearing is to convert airwaves into a electrochemical sound that our brain can translate of what we're hearing in our environment. So generally we have the pinna here, which is like the outer ear, and then we have the ear canal, which is like the still technically part of the outer ear. Once you get to the tympanic membrane or our eardrum, that's when we start getting closer to the middle ear, which the middle ear consists of the uticle, the saccule. I'm not pronouncing this right. There's the stapes, there's the incus, the malleus. Those are the bones in the inner ear, middle ear, excuse me. And then it'll be a fova in like the inner ear that can basically vibrate the fluids, like, oh, what's the fluid called? It's not synovial. It's like lymphofluid, endolymph or something like that. They'll vibrate the endolymph, which will go through the semicircular canals in the cocci, which will depolarize hair cells that will release electrical chemical to the brain. So, following the auditory pathway, the cochlea will go to the vestibular cochlear nerve, to the medial thalamus, then to the auditory cortex. And just to review some terms here, the semicircular tails detect rotational acceleration, so that's when you're like spinning on like a merry-go-round. That's what's spinning. And then the uticle and sacculus for linear acceleration. Alright, we made it to page 2. I'm just curious how many pages of behavior there is. 1, 2, 3. 3 more pages. And I'm already pretty freaking tired. So we might have to take a break here. Because I am going more in depth than I thought I would be. How long have I been going for? How long have I been streaming for? A half hour. Shit. Shoot. Okay. Well, let's just get through these sentences. I'll try to get through these pages here. Try to. Until I can't anymore. Let's try to at least get through behavior, because that's a good section I need to review. Okay. So, some other senses that we should know is the smell sense, or our olfactory bulb, which basically bypasses the thalamus using the olfactory chemoreceptors. Taste is our mouth. Different taste buds located on our tongue and help detect different dissolved compounds. Somatosensation is the 4 touch modalities, which I was talking about earlier with the homunculus. Proprioception is also tells us where our body is located in space. That's like using those semicircular canals for the rotation and stuff like that. Alright. Generally, we use 2 different types of processing for perception. And our general one, where we use like our data from our environment, is the bottom-up processing model, where we recognize objects by parallel processing and feature detection, which is slower but less prone to mistakes. And then the other model uses the top-down processing, which is basically using like our cortex of our background knowledge that we know of something to recognize the object, like memories or expectations, with little attention to detail. Like you know what a library looks like because you know from a memory what a library looks like, rather than looking at the specific details to consider. Oh, that is a library by seeing the books in the door, stuff like that. And then there's the Gestalt principles. They're basically shortcuts that our brain uses to fill in a missing picture missing parts of an image when it's incomplete. All right. Now we're getting into the learning section, which this is the operant conditioning, classical conditioning, information, associative learning, and non-associative learning, and apparently memory. All right. So, considering habituation, it is the process of becoming used to a stimulus. The general example that I always remember off the top of my head is you hear a beeping noise like at McDonald's or something, and you hear ding 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 ding, and over the period of time you may become habituated where you don't recognize that the beeping's going on all the time. That's the example habituation, and then dishabituation is when something interrupts the stimulus, making you realize that it's there again, which is usually caused by resensitization to the original stimuli. So example, the stops beeping for hours and then it comes back, you'll definitely notice that again. And then you'll have to be the whole habituation process again. When I see observational learning here, I think of the Bobo doll effect, where by watching the actions of others, we'll mimic those. So, like the Bobo doll, the parent punched the Bobo doll, and the kids mimicked the behavior because they thought it was acceptable since the adult did it. That's why they believe video games are bad. And then there is associative learning, which is basically pairing a stimuli with responses or behaviors and consequences, aka classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So classical conditioning is the idea where we have a neutral stimulus which becomes associated with an unconditioned stimulus. And then it can become a conditioned stimulus of another response. So for example, the unconditioned stimulus for Pavlov's dogs was food, and the unconditioned response that was neutral would be saliva being produced by the dogs. And then without the classical conditioning, Pavlov rang a bell, and the dog didn't respond at all to it. However, when the when Pavlov gave the dog food and then rang the bell, he classically conditioned the dog to start salivating when the bell was rang. Alright, that's just basically classic conditioning through a brief view. And then there's operant conditioning, which focuses on rewards and punishments, and then reinforcement and punishments. So when it says positive, negative, that's not like meaning it's a good thing or a bad thing, but rather than like you're adding something or removing something. So when we talk about a positive reinforcement, we're adding something that will promote a behavior, while a negative reinforcement is we're removing something to stop produce to stop. We have a negative reinforcement to remove something to continue that behavior. And then a positive punishment is we add something that to stop the behavior. And a negative punishment is we remove something to stop that behavior. And then lastly for this section is memory. So memory is divided up into many different categories. So we have sensory memory, so that's like a 1 second memory, which also can be classified. There's short-term memory, that's about a minute. But short-term memory works with the working memory, in which working memory can try to change it into a long-term memory, generally lifetime. Which lifetime can be divided up into many different categories under itself. Where I like to think about explicit is we're able to explicitly say something, while implicit is we're not aware of it. So explicit is under our conscious awareness. So if we're explicit, we have a declarative memory, which we talk about facts and events, which it can be further divided between episodic memory and semantic memory. Which episodic memory I think about like trauma events, like a hurricane, for example. You'll have some episodic memory of where you were during that event or experience. While semantic memory is just learning about facts and concepts that you use, like to solve a math problem. Now, going all the way back up to implicit memory, this is our unconscious memory. So we tend to focus on like procedural memory, like skills and tasks, such as like riding a bike, knowing how to use like a fork and spoon. You're not aware that you know how to do these things. You just are. All right. I'm gonna call it for now.